You mentioned earlier around suicide, you had steps people can take. What were you talking about there?
The information we have boils down to three things, and it is a very simple algorithm. A, B, C. It's the kind of thing you can put a little card in your wallet that has it. It's aloneness, burdensomeness, and capacity for suicide. You ask people, are you feeling alone? Are you feeling lonely? Burdensomeness. B, do you feel like your friends would be better off if you were gone? Hopelessness is crucial. Are you alone? Do you feel alone and lonely? Do you feel hopeless that will ever change? You illustrated it in your TEDx talk when you talked about the man you knew who survived jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. When he and all the other few people who survived it say as soon as they jumped, they regretted it.
Evolutionary biology and social dynamics play a key role in our mental health. And to thrive in modern society, we need to learn how to best look after ourselves among the challenges of contemporary society. Today I'm speaking to J. Anderson Thomson about evolutionary psychology and its principles to understand depression, suicide, substance abuse, and violence. Anderson is a psychiatrist in Charlottesville, Virginia. Welcome to Move Your Mind, where we uncover why you are holding yourself back from getting the life you want and what to do about it. With the help from high-achieving guests and experts in behavioural science, personal development, and the health and wellness space. Join us if you're ready to move out of your own way toward your ideal self. I'm your host, Nick Brax, and I've been working in the health and wellness space for the last 15 years, helping people find direction and gain the courage to take control of their life. My mission is simple: to help you learn everything that I wish I knew, so you can become your ideal self. Lacking guidance, I spent the majority of my youth feeling lost and disempowered, which led to depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, and substance abuse. Looking back, I didn't have the vocabulary to communicate what I was experiencing. And as a man, I didn't resonate with the emotional language used in traditional therapy. I didn't need to talk about my feelings. I needed tangible solutions to guide me toward building a life I was proud of. If you can relate, then this podcast is for you. In this episode, we discuss how you can master your mental health in the modern world. If you're ready to take action and build a stronger mindset, then keep listening. Andy, so great to meet you. Thank you for making the time to come on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Really appreciate it. Really appreciate you making the time. I'm just going to jump straight in by asking, can you share with our audience a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you came to be essentially doing the work that you're doing?
I'm a psychiatrist, and currently I'm at the University of Virginia Student Health Services, Counseling and Psychological Services. I also had, until recently, a private solo practice as well. Also did a lot of forensic psychiatry. And I think the main thing here is that probably sometime in the late 90s, a friend of mine gave me Robert Wright's book, The Moral Animal. And that shifted my focus to what is known as evolutionary psychology, Darwinian psychiatry. And I've been pursuing that ever since. And the focus has been on things like depression, suicide, general theories of psychopathology, also religion, what makes human minds vulnerable to generate religious beliefs. But I'm primarily a clinician. I spend most of my time seeing patients, and now exclusively young adults who are undergraduate or graduate or professional students at the University of Virginia.
Yeah, wow. So yeah, you've done a huge amount in the area. Have you seen have rates of depression, suicide, these areas you're talking about gone up in the last 20 years? Has there been a change in that? I mean, it seems more talked about now, but has it risen?
Well, I think it's a combination of it is more talked about, but I think it's also risen. I'm not an expert on the epidemiology of a lot of these things, but I particularly study suicide and suicide risk assessment, and would be happy to give you and the audience some things that I think are very important for suicide risk assessment that anybody can do, not just a mental health professional. And with regards to suicide, we know that the rates seem to be going up. In the United States, it's probably 14 per 100,000 per year. And the other thing that's of concern is that the ratio seems to be changing. It used to be 4-to-1 men to women, and now there's clearly a rise in women's suicide. And where I am in the state of Virginia, it's approximately 3-to-1. And
Mm.
it's young adults. And in point of fact, we have several suicides every year, and tragically, we lost a student last week to suicide. So it's a very real issue.
Wow. Yeah, I'm sorry to hear about the student. It's always it's a hard issue to talk about, and it's always something that I think a lot of us avoid talking about because it's
Yeah.
uncomfortable. And when you do start talking about it, you realize just how big of an issue it is. A lot of this really gets swept under the rug. We don't hear about it, but I mean those statistics alone are crazy. I didn't know that about women,
Yeah.
rising in those statistics as well. But yeah, it's a big problem.
Yeah, and I particularly liked your TED talk at, I think it was DocWorks, because you, right out of the box, 1 out of 40, every 40 minutes there's a suicide. I thought
Yeah.
that was just getting it out front, talking about it is huge.
Yeah, I mean that statistic when I was researching for that just really hit home. It sort of,
Yeah,
and I think a lot of this stuff we tend not to really think about it unless we've been directly affected
yeah.
ourselves or we've had that experience ourselves. So it's it's a weird thing where all of this stuff's going on, but we're not often that conscious about it. Uh, what do you think are some of the reasons that it is rising and that we have these statistics?
Um, I don't know, and I think we have to be humble before the facts of our ignorance. Rates of depression, I think, for young adults, expectations, pressures, um, feeling more. I think this situation, at least here, leads one to be more vulnerable to the things that drive suicide, particularly a sense of failure, huge expectations for success, and easily feeling like a failure. Um, the
Mm.
I know you've mentioned it, and other people, obviously, the impact of social media and making the false comparisons between myself and what out there looks like everybody else's success relative to my failure.
Yeah, yeah, they're big ones, and I guess that's 24/7. That pressure that we can put on ourselves for success, but it's not. It's all a lot of it is in our mind because we can really
Absolutely.
define. We get to choose to define what success is, but it's not as simple as that, is it?
No. And what we
Yeah,
see here is that, students come in and they feel like they have to do double or triple majors. They've got a major or minor in computer science and economics, and the rates of students going in, even taking humanities courses, falls off. Everybody feels like they've got to, put themselves in a position to be straight A in multiple domains, and the pressures become enormous.
yeah. When they're actually might be more fulfilled in other areas, but they're not allowing themselves to explore that because of the pressure they're putting on themselves or what they think is expected.
Absolutely. And I mean, I talk to patients all the time about, do you allow yourself the psychological space just to think about what you might be interested in? You're jumping through everybody else's hoops, and you clearly don't like computer science, but you feel like you've got to do it, or you don't like economics, but you feel like you have to do it. Do you ever allow yourself to step back and think about what you might like to do, and to explore some other areas? And
Yeah.
they'll they'll smile and nod at me like, okay, old man. And then, they just keep on trucking, and they wonder why they're depressed and miserable.
Well, I think what you're giving them there is the best possible advice anyone could get. And I had a recent example with this where I've always sort of prided myself on trying to follow my gut and, really take risks and, follow my passions. But the last 3 years, I had a break from acting and I was really busy with my business. And I kept telling myself the narrative that I'll get back into acting when I get the business to a certain point, when the pressure's off, when it's making more money, when I'm completely stable. And it got to a point where I was itching to just do it again, and I was getting depressed. And I thought, hang on, this is not logical. This is actually me afraid to do it. This is me trying to appease other people by thinking I need to do X, when all I wanted to do was go back into the thing that I'm actually passionate about. And as soon as I made that change, instantly, this just relief, the anxiety sort of subsided. So it's crazy. Even when you're conscious of it, you can sort of stay stuck in it if you don't really take action on changing something.
Yeah, and it goes to what one of my interests is. You got depressed, and I've been doing work with Paul Andrews at McMaster's, who I think is a brilliant psychologist who has unraveled, I think, a lot of the key elements of depression, and that depression is part of human nature. It's an evolved mechanism that tells us, Houston, you got a problem, and forces us to stop and focus on what may be the stresses. And obviously, I don't know, all the details of your situation, but there was clearly a conflict between what you felt you should be doing versus what you wanted to do, and the depression is an adaptation that arises and says, wait a second, we got to stop and figure this out and stop business as usual and take a look.
Yeah. So would you say when we experience depression or when we're feeling anxiety, we should be looking at that as a sign of, okay, I'm feeling incredibly anxious here. That's telling me something's not right. I've got to make a change. I'm feeling depressed. I need to so look at it as actually something potentially even useful where, okay, I've got this. This is telling me absolutely something's not right and I need to change something. I can't keep going in that same way, because we often don't do that. We just stay stuck in what we're doing. We play the victim. We might blame other things. We might say that it's because of whatever, we come up with on that day, but that doesn't help.
Right. And the way to think about it is it's like physical pain, right? If we've got physical pain, it's miserable, but thank God we have the capacity for pain. Pain is an evolved capacity to tell us there's a problem, to tell us how severe the problem is, tell us where it's located. If I've got a splinter in my hand, it's going to hurt a little bit, but unless you know me well, you're probably not going to pick up on it. If I've got a fish hook in my hand, I'm not going to be able to hide that. And that degree of pain is going to tell me I've got a severe problem. It's going to tell me where it's located, and it's going to stop business as usual. I'm not going to be able to do this podcast if I've got a fish hook in my hand. I might want to try to hide it from you, but I'm not going to be able to. The pain is going to be enough. It's going to signal you for help, and I'm going to have to focus on that fish hook and figuring out a way to get it out of my hand. And you want to think about anxiety and depression, again, as psychic pain. Okay, these are evolved capacities that tell us we got a problem. The severity of the symptom will often tell us the severity of the problem. And if we step back and look at what we're afraid of, or in the case of depression, if we look at what we're ruminating about, even though we try to block out those ruminations, that's a window into the issue. And depression and anxiety force us to stop business as usual and to focus on the problem and to try to solve it. And unfortunately, these days, at least in the United States, obviously I don't know what it's like in Australia, we've pathologized anxiety and depression way too much. And it's seen as sort of a separate disorder, like you've got a disordered brain. and we have to treat it, and we give people medications that at times blunt it to the point where it's not good. I can illustrate it this way. If I have that fish hook in my hand and I just load it up with anesthesia, we just inject my hand full of anesthesia so I'm not feeling the pain, and I continue with this podcast and continue on, that's really not a good thing. That fish hook may infect my hand, do more damage. And it's the same thing with depression and anxiety. I think we have to be careful. I had a patient who was depressed, and she said, the antidepressant has made me feel a whole lot better. I feel a whole lot better, but I'm still married to the same alcoholic, abusive man. And that caught my attention. The medication was, I think, preventing her from sorting out what she wanted to do about this marriage. And it was a complicated situation. She had children, financially dependent on him, the usual complexities. There's another illustration for this point that I'll put in here, because I think it's, again, crucial. I mean, there's evidence out there that supports this theory. When physicians make a serious error, when they harm a patient, even kill a patient, they get depressed. And what's interesting is they get depressed. They're trying to focus on how did it happen, what happened, and the more depressed these physicians get, the more likely they are to make a change in their practices. It has utility. And if you step back and think about it, you wouldn't want to go to a physician who, if he or she made a serious error, just sort of blew it off or blame the anesthesiologist or something like that. You wouldn't want to see such a person. But I think what happens in physicians who make serious errors is an illustration of the adaptive, utilitarian nature of depression. Just like physical pain, it's painful, it's unpleasant, but it is stopping business as usual and forcing us to sort out and solve the problems that caused it.
I love those examples, Andy, because I think the tangible part is what's missing so often. And a big portion of our listener base are men. And what I've found, similar to my own experience, is men, everyone, I think male and female, but a lot of men are frustrated because they hear this information, or they might be told, okay, here's what the problem is, but they think, just tell me what to do. How do I change it? What can I actually do about it? And when mental health is such an intangible thing, if we don't have a very clear blueprint of what the situation is and what to do, we can just get stuck. So looking at it in that way, and I mean, it is similar in Australia. I had that experience myself where I was struggling with anxiety and depression in my early 20s, saw so many different experts, was put on random medications at times. They weren't right. It was only actually until my 30s that I finally found out I had ADHD, was medicated for that. And that medication actually allowed me to then just operate and make decisions a lot more efficiently and better. But like you're saying there, if with the knowledge I have now, it terrifies me, the thought that I could have been put on some random medication that I didn't need and stayed on it and never really known what the problem was and just sort of numbed myself. So it's such a complicated area where, yes, medication can be important. It's never going to be the only solution, important with taking action as well, but it's such a very nuanced thing. So we need more education on that for sure.
Yeah, no, I think that's the point, that it is more complicated. Medications are often a godsend, but it's a much more complicated issue than I think my profession is willing to admit.
Yeah, absolutely. With men, how big of an issue it is. So I think I was talking about there, a lot of the time I've found men, there's more conversation about mental health now, but I feel like underneath that, I mean, the statistics we were talking about in suicide obviously show this, but they're not really taking the steps necessary a lot of the time. There's still a lot of stigma. Oftentimes even and I've seen this when I do talks in companies, these, CEOs, these really manly sort of guys who never talk about it. Eventually you break through a wall and they're just so relieved to talk about it.
Mhm.
But then you hear other scenarios where they might have been wanting to talk about it for 10 years and finally had the courage to say something, and then someone shut them down and then they never talk about it again. So yeah, how big of an issue is that, and what can we do as men to encourage other men to make these changes?
I think it's a steep mountain that we have to climb, and I think well, the kind of thing you do. I mean, being out front with your life, what happened to you, um, uh, making education as widely available as possible. I think trying to encourage men to talk to each other, encourage men's support groups, encouraging men to get therapy. Uh, I think you come at it from as many different directions as you can.
Mm.
If you think about it, 30 years ago, there were not podcasts like you're doing. There weren't conversations like this. And I think, hopefully that seeps in and by osmosis affects some men to give them more courage to come forward with their problems and to talk to other men.
Yeah,
But I think
absolutely.
I think you know it better than I. I mean, it's a problem, I think, probably in most societies, and even in highly educated Western democratic societies, there's still a stigma, and I think it's particularly hard for men to acknowledge suffering and to talk to others and to seek help.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And we need to hear other people's stories. We need to feel like it's okay to be having these issues, and that there is actually help out there, and there is a solution. So yeah, I love that.
Hmm.
Um, you've probably seen so many changes in the world over your time. What would you say? Uh, uh, I guess if you look sort of back 20 to 30 years, what what were we doing better, if anything, 20 to 30 years ago, and what are we doing better now? And then what are the sort of the negatives that we're facing now that we didn't have back then?
Wow.
If there is.
Yeah, that's it. Well, I think clearly the progress in science, right? Let me just focus on that. I mean, I went to medical school at a time where we did not have all the things that we have now. And for me, that's one of the biggest changes. You have the ability to diagnose without painful interventions. The advent of imaging, of PET scans, MRIs, I think that's huge. People don't have to suffer to get an accurate diagnosis. That's one thing. I think also obviously our understanding of disease at a biochemical level, extraordinary. The the improvements in pharmacology, if we just take a narrow view of that, when I did my training, you had the old typical antipsychotics that gave everybody Parkinson's symptoms. You had the old MAO inhibitors, the tricyclics. That was it in terms of antidepressants. You had benzodiazepines, Valium for anxiety. And now we have a much broader toolbox of medications. So I think, that's a huge sea change. And the current generation, that's all they know, but they don't know what it was like, say, 20, 30, 50 years ago. So I think the one of the really important changes, which now is just part of our routine life, is the enormous progress in diagnostics, in therapeutics, in understanding. In my particular area, I think two things. One, the huge explosion in knowledge in neuroscience. And then the other thing, which is not talked about much, but I think will increasingly come to the fore, is applying basic Darwinian evolutionary theory to an understanding of psychology, psychopathology, human nature. The mind is what the brain does. It was shaped by Darwinian natural selection over, millions and millions of years. And I think that actually gives us a fundamental anatomy of human nature. I think it helps, to narrow it here, I think it gives us a much better understanding of depression, anxiety, substance abuse, alcoholism, suicide. I think, I think that's why my life took a 180-degree turn in the late 1990s. I think that theoretical base is going to help us, already is helping us. And that may not be as widely known.
Yeah, which is fascinating because, I mean, it seems somewhat logical to think about that, but we don't really go to that, of how our behaviors have evolved. Why do we feel this way? Why is it that so religion's a big part of why that's been not as explored in this area?
Yeah, I think there's multiple reasons. One,
Yeah.
the basic human vanity, human narcissism. We don't want to acknowledge that we're risen apes, not fallen angels. We're animals, and also, as you mentioned, the deep religious opposition to Darwinian natural selection, the basic modern Darwinian synthesis and its application to human minds.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, well, I mean, that's exciting to know that, that there's a lot more to go in exploring these areas, in understanding ourselves and our behaviors and how we could make these changes. So you mentioned earlier around suicide, you had, I think you were saying, I can't remember if you said a guidebook or a process or steps people can take if around symptoms towards that, or what were you talking about there?
Well, yeah, I think there's a lot of knowledge about suicide. There's
Yeah.
still a lot of debate about its origins. Is suicide itself an adaptation? Are we designed in certain situations to kill ourselves? Is it a Darwinian adaptation, or is it a byproduct of other factors? And that's going to be an ongoing debate. But we still know enough that I think you can make better predictions of suicide risk. And this is something that I feel very strongly about. And you don't need to be a psychologist. You don't need to be a psychiatrist to utilize this. And the information we have boils down to actually three things that you, your friends, your colleagues, all of us can do if we see somebody who we're worried is at risk for suicide. And it is a very simple algorithm. It's ABC. And this is all it is ABC. It's the kind of thing you can put a little card in your wallet that has it. And what it is, it's basically aloneness, burdensomeness, and capacity for suicide. And you clearly want to ask people if they're feeling suicidal. And do they have suicidal plans? Do they have suicidal feelings? But you know that, particularly men, if they do have those, frequently they're not going to tell us. So what ways are there to sort of make an end around? And again, you ask people, are you feeling alone? Are you feeling lonely? Are you miserably alone? And you're just keeping that to yourself, all right? And so that's aloneness, A. Burdensomeness, B. Do you feel like your friends would be better off if you were gone? Do you feel like your family would be better off if you were dead? Do you feel like if you killed yourself, yeah, they'd get over it and just go on? And yes, they'd be upset, but in the long run, they'd be relieved that you're a burden to them. They'd be better off without you. So that's the two important psychological dimensions, A and B, aloneness and burdensomeness. We've always known that hopelessness is a risk factor for suicide, but hopelessness is a risk factor on those two issues. That's where hopelessness is crucial. So, are you alone? Do you feel alone and lonely? And do you feel hopeless that that will ever change?
Yeah.
Do you feel a burden to your buddies, to your family, to your friends? Do you feel like they'll be better off without you? And do you feel hopeless that that will ever change? Do you feel like you've lost your job, you're never going to get hired again, that you're sort of always going to be a burden on your family, that's never going to change? So again, it's A, aloneness, B, burdensomeness, and hopelessness about that ever changing, right? So that, and then the third is capacity, the capacity to kill yourself, right? And you illustrated it in your TEDx talk when you talked about the man you knew who survived jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. And when he and all the other few people who survived it say as soon as they jumped, they regretted it. Okay. And we have a strong self-preservative instinct. We have you want to call it a life force, but we have a strong self-preservative instinct, and you have to develop the capacity to override that to kill yourself. Killing oneself is a difficult, fearsome task, and you have to acquire the capacity to do that, right? And so how do you measure acquired capacity? Well, you can just ask the person to start off with, do you feel you have the capacity to kill yourself? And anything other than no tells you that the person has got some fearlessness around suicide, right? So you ask the person, do you have the capacity? And see what they say. And then what you know about their history. So somebody who has had a lot of self-injury, the person that's been a cutter, who has, you want to think about people with histories of cutting and self-injury. They're desensitizing their body towards self-inflicted injury. So they're acquiring the capacity for lethal self-harm. Oddly enough, people who are heavily tattooed are at greater risk because they're used to injuring their body. People who have, and this is, again, what I like about this helps explain stuff we've already known. So people who have been raped, people who've been sexually abused as children, they've had bodily violations. They're unfortunately they're desensitized to bodily violations, which lowers their vulnerability to killing themselves. People who have prior suicide attempts. So this is, again, I think, an explanation for what we've known all along, that one of the risks for suicide is prior attempts, right? Because you, again, have desensitized yourself to lethal self-harm. People who've had combat training, who have, knowingly put themselves in situations of self-induced pain and suffering. And this may be why we have seen higher rates in the military. You don't have to have been in Iraq in combat or Afghanistan. The mere fact of going through combat training is probably a risk factor and unfortunately lowers vulnerability to suicide. Men, we've been talking about men. Why is the rate higher in men? Well, men probably have been injured more, been in fights more. They've suffered physically, and so they probably, again, have more of the acquired capacity for lethal self-harm. But it's a very simple algorithm that you can sort of keep in your wallet. And if somebody you're worried about, and you talked about trusting your gut. I think this also gives us a solid reason to trust our gut. Somebody is saying, they're not suicidal. But if you start asking them about aloneness and burdensomeness, and what's going to happen is, even though they're going to try to hide that from you, again, that self-preservative instinct is going to kick through. And also, you've surprised them. You haven't asked them the traditional questions, and you may break through, and they're going to talk about the aloneness. They're going to talk about the feeling that family would be better off if they were dead. And that will help you make a better judgment about their risk for suicide and getting them help.
Yeah, wow. Well, I think that's brilliant. That it's so simple what you're talking about there. That formula to have, and that I love that. I think I'm going to share that with as many people as I can, because I think, yeah, it just makes so much sense. And that's the problem. A lot of the time, people don't. They might see someone that's struggling, but we don't know what to ask, how to approach it. So I think that's a great formula.
I think it's, and here I want to give credit where credit's due. If people are interested in the issue of suicide, this comes from the work of Thomas Joyner, who's a psychologist and I think arguably one of the world's experts on suicide. And his books he writes beautifully. They're very approachable. Why people die by suicide, myths about suicide. He has a book on murder-suicide, the perversion of virtue. Also, the American psychologist who's in New Zealand, Jesse Baring, suicidality. And basically, what I'm telling you is based on their work. They didn't put it in ABC terms, but when you read their work, the ABC just sort of jumps off the page. And it's a very useful algorithm that I said, if we could, just like we're training people to pick up on the signs of stroke in people, I think this is where we're just trying to educate the average layman about the signs of stroke so they can get somebody to an emergency room. This is the same thing. If you just remember ABC, aloneness, burdensomeness, capacity to kill yourself. And I think that will, help us identify the people who are at big risk, usually men, trying to hide it.
Hey guys, if you're enjoying this podcast, please click the subscribe button, leave a like or comment, share with your friends, and follow me on Instagram at Nick Brax. I really appreciate your ongoing support. Absolutely. And, loneliness, one of the big ones you're talking about there. How big of an issue is that? Because it feels like in the especially in modern times, where relationships, intimate relationships, from what I can see, seem harder to sort of maintain. People are on dating apps looking for the next thing. We've got, we feel like we're more connected because of the internet, social media, but we're spending way more time alone. And we're built to be in communities, which we don't have. And how big of an impact is that playing? How important is it that we have, intimate relationships?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because it's huge. And this goes back actually to, I think it was a 1988 article in one of the major journals in science, the journal Science, and where they showed the rise in loneliness and its relationship to even medical disease. And the rise in loneliness has been huge. I may not have the numbers right, but I think surveys, at the turn of the century, it was like 1 in 10 people said they had no close friend. And I think now it's something like 1 in 4 people say they have no close friend.
Oh my God.
You're absolutely right. Social media has created this huge connectedness, but it's a superficial connectedness. And we evolved in small hunter-gatherer groups. We're an ultra-social, ultra-cooperative species. And now relationships are, maybe we have more acquaintances, but we have fewer really deep connections with people. And if there are people in your audience who are interested, there's a psychologist in the United States. I can never pronounce his name. It's Cacioppo. I think that's how you pronounce it. He has a book on loneliness. He has articles on loneliness, but he has a superb TEDx talk on loneliness. And anybody interested in this topic, I would, point them towards Cacioppo's work because it's brilliant. And I think he was one of the early people to see the problem and really try to study it in depth. I mean, he even has papers on the neurology of loneliness. It's huge. Yeah,
Appreciate that.
and
Yeah.
it's related to it's related to um, medical illness. There's some stunning statistic that if you've had a heart attack, the prediction of having a second heart attack isn't predicted on hypertension, blood pressure, anything else. The main predictive factor is whether you had any friends. It's a huge factor, obviously for mental health, but it's a huge factor for medical health.
That's unbelievable. Yeah,
Yeah.
well, I'll be having a look at that TEDx straight after this as myself. But a recent example I was telling you about this play that I did recently. Whenever I've
Mm-hmm.
done something like that, you're with this group of people. It's very intimate. There's 10 of us there. You're spending a lot of time together. You're cooperating. You're having to all work together to achieve this common goal. And the feeling every time I've done that, it's been this high that you get on where it's just like this feels so. I just feel so aligned. I feel so grounded after it.
Mm-hmm.
And then you go back to day-to-day life, and I sometimes start to feel, I miss that feeling because
Oh.
I spend a lot of my time. I've got an amazing girlfriend. I've got a close group of friends, but still spend a lot of time alone where you're
Mm-hmm.
working on a computer and all that sort of stuff, and you're craving that community sort of connection.
Yeah, and I think I would submit to you that that's a good sign.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that it causes you pain and you miss it, we'd be much more worried about you if you didn't feel that.
Yeah.
Because that you're aware of that that's the norm. We evolved in small, close hunter-gatherer groups, and we're not designed to live alone and be alone. For most of our evolutionary history, being alone was potentially deadly. I mean, you did not want to be alone. Just independent of loneliness. I mean, you did not want to be alone. And the modern world is sort of out of sync with our fundamental design. And you noticed it. You had these close relationships. They were they put you. I would argue they put you in a healthy baseline. And then when it stopped, you missed it because you missed what is a healthy baseline. And even though you've got a great girlfriend and these other things, you're alone with a computer too much of the time, and that's really, for our system, it's not designed to do that, and it's aversive. It's
Yeah.
not healthy, and you were picking up on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I
And
think we all feel it, yeah, to a degree.
yeah, and the fact that you missed it and found it upsetting, even though it's painful, that's good because that motivates you to try to find ways to recapture it.
100%. Yeah, that's been, for me, one of the big drivers of wanting to pursue a career in the arts in that area, because I just love that collaborative side of it, to be around people. So yeah.
Well, that's the basic design. I mean, we survived. I mean, Homo sapiens survived and prospered. It's not because we were the biggest, strongest animal on the block. It's because we became ultra social. We're just like the bees. We actually meet all the criteria for what's called eusociality. Intense, cooperative relationships. We're also what are called cooperative breeders. I'll gladly have you hold one of my grandchildren. A chimpanzee won't even let her sister hold her kid.
Yeah.
But we're ultra cooperative, ultra social, and that's why we've been so successful. But then the modern world sticks us in situations that, on the surface, look great. I love word processing. I love Google and being able to find information without having to schlep to the library and stand in a Xerox machine for a couple hours. But the downside is, like you, I'm often hours alone with a computer.
Yeah. It's a bizarre contradiction, and
Mm-hmm.
like you were talking about earlier, where you could have students that are putting all this pressure on themselves, doing these double, triple degrees, whatever it is, when they want to do something else. But the world is pushing us the other way. But if you just make that decision, and it might be about, oh, but I want to make more money, or I want this, or I want that. But then if you go and do the thing, like we talked about there, put yourself in a community environment, feel connected, all of the things that you're thinking all of this money and achievement will bring you instantly come without even needing to make any money or have any, success or anything, just from putting yourself in those situations. So there's a much more simple solution that is actually obtainable, rather than saying, I'm only going to be happy when blah, blah, blah happens that I can't actually control anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's a tragedy. I mean, it's one of the few things, and they're very few, that make me glad at moments I'm in the twilight of my life. I mean, I'm not sure if I was an adolescent in this world, I wouldn't be adversely affected. I'm grateful for the very simple childhood and adolescence I had relative to what a lot of teenagers and young adults are facing these days.
It's a crazy thing. Yeah, it's funny to look back like that. Even I just missed growing up with social media, and I didn't have a phone until I was 16, and I'd grow up playing in the park and all that stuff. And I look back now, and I'm so grateful that I got to have that, because I'm scared for when I have kids, the world they're going to grow up in, and how do you manage that for them? How do you help them navigate that? Because it's the Wild West now, really.
Yeah, well, there's a new, again, your listeners and you might be interested in it. There's a social psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, who has a new book about, this issue. And he is a strong advocate for a phone-free childhood. I mean, he would not have children have phones until they're, I think practically 18, that you would not have phones in school. That you would have kids outdoors, you would have kids playing and taking risks and doing things. I think he's brilliant, and I think it's a brilliant book. I will send you the link to one. I'll send you one of the articles. But the book just came out. He's getting a lot of interviews. It's getting a lot of play, and I think it'll also. The other thing I think it will help validate what a lot of parents are doing who feel alone. I know parents who, their kids don't have phones, and it's that's hard for those kids, but the parents, no phones until they're 18. No, there's one computer in the household where everybody can see what the kid is on. But there's, basically, no devices. My son who lives in California has done that, and I initially thought he was a little bit too strict, but I think he's right on the money.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it seems like it's really, such an important path to go down and look into, because otherwise there's no end to it, and you're getting them addicted to the dopamine hits of all this stuff at such a young age when your brain's developing. It's crazy. So.
No, it's, and I think the thing I like about Jonathan's book is that it will empower people who, already recognize it and who are struggling to, explain to their kids why they're doing this and to their friends. And I'm hoping it gets wide play and will, have more parents feeling confident in pushing back. And again, it goes to what I was talking about earlier. I think one of the real important things about the evolutionary psychology approach is it tells us this fundamental mismatch between, our original design and now how is a mismatch with much of the world we've created. And social media and the phones and all that is a huge mismatch. You and I were fortunate. Our childhoods, were more normal and more what's the design. We could play and learn by error, learn by playing, learn by, being outside. I know you did sports. I think it's huge.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I'll be looking more into this myself. So we finish up with 5 closing questions. These can be sort of quicker answers, whatever comes to mind for you.
Certainly.
Before I go into that, I just interested to ask you what are some things that you personally do for yourself to look after your mental health and well-being?
Um, I think several things. I try to exercise every day. I think that's important. You know, I try, underline the word try, um, to have a good diet, but you know, you know, dark
I share
chocolate,
I
dark,
share that
dark,
struggle with you.
yeah, yeah, you know, dark chocolate is, hard to, um, exercise, a good diet. Um, I try to get decent sleep. I try to be aware of my stresses. I do try to mitigate my stresses. I don't always succeed. I try to avoid television. Um, I try to stay away from a daily dose of the news, and particularly the news in the United States is awful these days, obviously. Um, and well, the news in much of the world. I mean, I feel responsible to at least know what's going on, but I try not to saturate myself in it. I really work hard at having friendships and close friendships. Um, uh, Several of my friends who I went to college with, they now live very isolated lives, and that really made an impression on me. So my wife and I work very hard to have friends, do things. Um, I think those are some of the things. And I mean, a lot of that stuff used to be thought of as California pop psychology, and were dismissed by traditional psychiatry. And now, again, thanks to the neuroscience revolution, I mean, we have solid empirical evidence that aerobic exercise is anti-anxiety, antidepressant, helps with sleep. We know all the marvelous things that it does for the brain and the body. We now know that our brain is a social brain, and so there's tons of evidence. And you noticed it in your experience with that play. It had huge impact on your brain. You noticed how you felt. I in enhanced sociality. I've also stopped alcohol. I mean, I never had problems with it, but I love my beer like the next guy. But I thought the evidence was out there that it should just stop it. Side note on that, again, I think a lot of people beat up on themselves about their substance use and their alcohol. But again, I think this is where an evolutionary understanding really helps, because all of us are evolved to drink alcohol. Originally, it was, much less potent. All of us are evolved to utilize plant neurotoxins, nicotine, cannabis, all those things. Our system is actually evolved to use those things because it helped kill parasites, particularly worms. And so again, it gets to the issue of not beating up on oneself, not feeling ashamed or those things. If you're vulnerable to alcohol and vulnerable to cannabis, tobacco, they're still not good for you. But being bad for you is different from being a bad person for doing it, or a failure. So again, I think an evolutionary understanding really helps. But I think stopping, trying to stop alcohol, stop substances. For the people out there that use marijuana, I think there's just increasing evidence that cannabis worsens everything. The cannabis that's out there now is so high potency that, where I work, we really work hard to try to get our patients off of all cannabis. So I think those are some of the, I appreciate that's a long-winded answer, but, those are some of the things, I try to do for my health that I think are applicable across the board for everybody.
Thank you for sharing those. And just finally on the alcohol thing, I totally agree. And I quit a year and a half ago,
Yeah.
and I had a problem with binge drinking more than 10 years ago. So it wasn't really an issue, but I was finding, like you're saying there,
Mm-hmm.
it's such a part of society. You catch up with family, friends, an event, there's alcohol everywhere. I actually
Mm-hmm.
found it significantly easier to just quit than to try and monitor how much I had, because it's so
Mm-hmm.
involved in everything that just making that boundary with I just don't do it anymore. I didn't even
Yeah.
have to think about it after that, and it wasn't really hard. And the benefits of that have been huge. So yeah, it's an
Yeah.
interesting area.
No, I saw you. I did watch your video on your stopping alcohol. And I
Oh,
think
thank
that
you.
again, that kind of thing is useful to have out there. But again, I want to emphasize again that we know why we drink. I mean, that alcohol boosts the hormones in our brain that have to do with sociality. Alcohol enhances bonding. Um,
Yeah,
and there's really interesting work that we owe civilization to alcohol because alcohol was our original antimicrobial. It's connected with the rise of big cities and great cities that had no civil engineering, and people were constantly exposed to enteric infections. And alcohol was our original antimicrobial or original antibiotic.
mm.
So you just have people have to be careful about beating up on themselves about their drinking. We're all vulnerable. We're designed to take in alcohol,
Yeah,
and I think uh, trying to reduce recrimination, internal self-attack, and again, I think a baseline understanding of why we're all sitting ducks for substance use and alcohol is a real help. At least I've found it a real help in my practice and working with patients and with colleagues, education.
yeah, yeah. It's such an important point with everything, not to beat ourselves up, to be able to pull yourself out, see the situation, and think, okay, that this is what it is. What can I do?
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be maybe a better decision for myself, or what do I need? So anyway, I'm taking up far too much of your time here.
No, no, look, you have no idea, because uh, be careful what you ask for, because no, I really appreciate the opportunity, because I think I hope I've made clear. I mean, I really appreciate the opportunity to uh, communicate this information, which I think is crucial. It's not yet widely known, and I think it has huge um, yeah, practical utility for everybody, but also particularly for mental health professionals and also for people who are like you, mental health advocates.
Absolutely. No, well, I appreciate that. And I already know our audience will get so much out of this, because everything you're saying is so relevant. And you've got very, practical, sort of tangible advice for what people can actually do if they want to look into this. So I think it's amazing what you're talking about. We'll jump into these final 5 questions. The first one is, what's your best childhood memory that comes to mind for you?
Ooh, you do. You ask hard questions. Best childhood memory. Um, childhood memory. I think just I was lucky in the people I went to elementary school with. I was lucky to go to a nice elementary school that had a great group of kids, because we're shaped by our peers more than our parents, and I think that was certainly formative. I was very lucky in that regard. Early childhood education is important, and
Mm.
I I I was lucky and had a great group of peers and a great group of teachers. There's no one memory. There's just a general gestalt of that time in my life at George Mason Elementary School in Alexandria, Virginia.
Yeah, I love that. What would you say is the biggest burden on mental health currently in society?
Um, I think not enough funding.
Yeah, that's a big
You
one.
know, I think
Yeah,
I think there are a lot of, at least where I am, there are a lot of people who are dedicated professionals who there are plenty of people who want to get training and become mental health professionals. There are a lot of people that I don't think we're lacking people who are passionate about it and want to get training and want to help people. But again, I think the funding, and particularly the funding for community mental health centers, the people who have severe mental illnesses, who tragically sort of live in the shadows of life. I think funding, and particularly funding for the chronically severely mentally ill, they make up probably 3/4 of our homeless population, and I just don't think we recognize that. And schizophrenia is the worst illness known to man, and we just are not taking care of those less fortunate than we are.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. I was living in Vancouver for a while, and I'd walk down Hastings Street and had one of the biggest sort of congregations of homeless people in the world, and I couldn't believe it. But I'd walk down, and you're just sitting there thinking, "This is crazy. We need to do more. There needs to be more support, more funding." It's a really big issue. Yeah,
right. And I think it should be a scar on the conscience of the world. I mean, there are people who, by by no choice of theirs, who have the worst illness known to man, and we're not recognizing it and having the appropriate compassion and empathy and backing it with resources to make their lives a little bit more bearable.
Yep, empathy is really, a key thing there, because if we do take the time to think, hang on, this is just a person the same as me, and maybe, like you're saying, it might be a mental illness, maybe they've had one phase of their life where something just went a little bit wrong that they couldn't get out of it, but they're no different to any of us, and any of us could actually end up in that situation in the right circumstances. So
exactly.
Yeah.
No, I love the late great Robin Williams, and he talked about the homeless, and particularly the homeless veterans, who are huge in this country, huge number. He talked about them. He called them the MIAs, the missing in America. And I think he's, I love that idea.
He was amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, he was.
Absolutely. What would you say is your personal definition of happiness?
My personal definition. Well, it's interesting you ask that, because that's something I've studied, and I think, again, I like simple algorithms, and I think the evidence supports. If people want to be happy, think about a AAA battery. Okay, agency, attachments, altruism. I think we know that if we are just living our life dancing to other people's tunes and we don't have any agency, it's a recipe for misery. I think attachments, as we talked about, connections with other people, deep connections with other people, so good attachments, and then altruism. I think if you're feeling miserable, one of the first things you should do is go help somebody. And so agency, attachments, altruism. And I think if you can keep those in mind, usually if you're not happy, there's something putting strain on one of those A's.
Yeah. Well, that's another great, simple, practical thing that I know our listeners will take out of it. And it's so true. It's funny that when you are struggling and you're feeling depressed, you're in your own head, the last thing you're sort of feeling like doing is something for someone else, because you're just thinking about yourself. But that's the crazy thing. It really does take you out of that, and it brings you back to, and nothing really makes you feel better than trying to do something greater than yourself. So it's
there's a famous psychologist whose name I'm blacking on at the moment, but he talked about when he was growing up, and he would go to his mother and be complaining about something, and she would just say to him, something like, John, just go help somebody.
Yeah. It's so, the last thing you're thinking of doing, but it's the thing you need. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites.
That's great. Well, two more here. If you could give one piece of advice to your 18-year-old self, what would that be?
I think it would probably be something along the lines of loosen up and smell the roses. I was a very I was a very driven 18-year-old, and I was very anxious about where I would go to school, where I would go to university. I was very anxious about success, and um, uh, um,
Hmm.
one of my friends, one of my close friends here said, um, uh, he said one of my characteristics was, Andy's the person that looks more depressed than he actually is. Um, and I think if people saw me as an 18-year-old, I was probably not a whole lot of fun. I was probably, Mr. Serious, and it was probably accurate. I was kind of driven and kind of serious, and I think if I could have loosened up a little bit, it would have been helpful because I was again lucky. I had a great group of friends. I was surrounded by lovely peers in the where I grew up. And I went to a public school, and I was lucky. And I just had, I was around great peers, and I just wish I'd loosened up a little bit.
I think a lot of us can take something out of that, and I totally relate. And I had a similar sort of experience when I was younger, where you just through putting too much pressure on yourself, even though everything's there to be happy or to get what you need. But yeah, a lot of us can probably take some advice out of that one there.
Yeah.
Final one. I'm sure I know there's many of these just from listening to you, but what would you say you're most proud of?
I think, if life is love and work, I think I'm proud that I made a very good choice in a partner, um, and um, and who is a unbelievable mother, and I'm you really can't take credit for your children. I mean, it's luck, but I feel very lucky there, and I think in terms of work, what I'm proudest of is the little book I did on religion, why we believe in gods, because I think it's really important. People don't realize that we understand now. The evidence is out there. We now know how and why human minds generate religious belief, why we're all vulnerable to them. And I think it's going to be very important for that to be part of education. Because I think all you have to do is look around the world. And I think what Christopher Hitchens said was true, that religion poisons everything. I think one of the main barriers we have to civil democratic societies is religion. And I think you're seeing, at least in this country, a terrible rise again of Christian nationalism that's poisonous. Obviously, you look at Hamas, and that's Islamic jihadism, which is a terrible poison in the world. And I think it's very important that people realize that there is no God. We're in charge of this, and we now know, just like we know much of why we're vulnerable to alcoholism, why we're vulnerable to substances. We now know why we're vulnerable to religious belief and why religions hijack human minds. And so I think that in terms of work, I think that little book I'm very proud of. And I'm also and again, I feel lucky, but I'm very proud of the work I've done with Paul Andrews on depression. But he's the one I was fortunate to, help out clinically, but he's been the driving force of the ideas there. So I think those things, the religion book and the work we've done on depression.
Yeah, well, I mean, so much that you've done there. And again, I just greatly appreciate you giving me your time here, giving our audience your time.
Wait a second. Who's giving who time here? You're giving me an enormous opportunity and, a platform that, few people are lucky to have. So, the gratitude comes from me, man.
I appreciate that. Well, final thing, where can our listeners go if they want to learn more about you, find your books, anything else? Where can we send them?
I have a website that has my work and has the books, and I certainly you're free to give people my email. People want to email me, and they can contact me through the website.
Oh, great. Well, we'll have a link to the website in
yeah,
the
and
show notes.
but that's got the books, it's got the articles, it's got videos of talks I've given on these issues.
Oh, fantastic. Well, anyone listening, make sure to go to the show notes, click on the link, check out the website. And Andy, love chatting to you. I'd love to chat longer. I hope we can stay in touch. Everything you're doing is so impressive. So yeah, thank you for.
Well, again, thank you, and I will send you articles and links to some of the things that I think you'll like and will help with your advocacy, and your listeners would like as well.
Really appreciate that. Yeah, thank you again.
Again, the gratitude is all mine. Nice to meet you, and thank you again.
Thank you, J. Anderson Thomson, for joining me today and offering your insights. And thank you for listening. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the episode and any suggestions for topics you'd like to hear more about. Feel free to leave a comment or send a DM. Your feedback is always appreciated. Please don't forget to click the subscribe button, leave a like or comment, share with your friends, and follow me on Instagram. It really makes a difference. Thank you so much.